My name is Todd. I live in England. I also play football for Arsenal, if anybody has seen this guy. I get said all the time that I look like this guy, but he's a lot richer than I am. This is a new project of mine, so I now work for myself. I run a website, Ultimate Angular, where I try and help people learn Angular. So jumping straight into the talk, we have two types of forms, the template-driven forms and the reactive, which we call the model-driven forms. We are obviously going to go with the reactive side today. So before we even sort of dive into thinking about reactive forms, what do they mean, how do we actually use them, I want to talk real quick about the design and how they are easier/better to actually get started with. So the first thing is componentizing. If you ever built forms in like Angular 1.x, it became quite difficult to componentize them. Whereas with the reactive forms, it's easier to bind different groups and form layers that you can basically register with the form. So we'll be working on some of this stuff. There's a focus on controls. This will make more sense as we continue. The beautiful word dynamic forms. I blogged a few days ago. If anyone wants to do some dynamic stuff or ask how to do dynamic forms after, come and find me. And they also have the observables baked in. Most importantly, we avoid stuff like $parent.parent.parent, which comes with the 1.x. So the design of the new forms have kind of made this go away. So it becomes much cleaner, it becomes much easier. Let me try. If you haven't used reactive forms or any Angular forms at the moment, what you can do, check out those links. They're kind of like introductions to both concepts, so you can see the differences between the two. Then I'm using some Batman slides throughout this talk, but I've actually built a completely irrelevant pizza app. So if you want the source code for the pizza app that I'll be demoing, that's the bottom link. I'll show it in a minute. I know everyone's hungry. So we are going with the reactive side of things. What I'll do real quick is just show you the application. So this is actually, I upgraded this earlier this week from V2 to V4 RC3. There was some huge, over 50% generated code savings. So this is like super lightweight. I just wanted to say that because it's amazing. So what we've got a name, email, if email is required. If I do something and then mess it up, we've got emails must match. So these are just kind of like common and easy things to add. We've got the addresses. There's no like funky validation for postcodes and stuff. We also have the pizzas. So if you like Domino's like me, then you'll know this kind of interface. You can select the different types of pizzas. This uses some of the animations, and they all fall down from heaven. You can select the sizes and add a new pizza, add some bacon, and then swap them around. So once you've done all that, you can place the order and then get your delicious pizza. So this is what I've taken all the concepts from and put them into the talk. So high-level reactive, if you want to get started with reactive, there's a few steps that you need to actually take. So the first one is the reactive forms module. We need to just go ahead and import it. Form controls are pretty common. You've probably seen these if you're browsing the reactive docs. Then we have the form groups and form arrays, and FormBuilder, and validators. So these kind of are the most common things that you use. We'll come on to what they do individually and how we can actually integrate them. And then if you've taken a more deeper step into the Angular docs, you'll come across these strange words like control value accessor, the abstract controls, the ng value accessor. And you may have seen like tutorials for custom validators or async validators and how do I do these kind of things. So this is what we're going to cover today. So we're going to look at the form groups, the form arrays, the form controls. We're going to look at how we've implemented the form group validation. So like where we had the emails do not match, we basically compare the values of the two. How to go ahead and use a form array. There's an interesting piece which, yeah, I'll leave that and come back to it. So we also want to understand probably the coolest piece of the reactive forms, which is building our own custom form controls. So this is how we can basically create a reusable component and bind a control straight to it. These items inside of here, so these are all custom form controls. And if I use my arrows, you can see I'm toggling between these because they're underneath, they're actually like using form elements. Similarly with these, I'm hitting the space bar, and that's adding and removing the state. So we've got small conceptual learnings, and I call them real demos from my fake pizza app. So let's begin. Hopefully, I can't zoom in anymore. Hopefully that's a good size. So step one is the easy step. We'd go ahead, import the Reactive Forms module. This is like a quick overview of how we'll set it up, the concepts behind them. So then we have our typical ng module. This can be in any particular module, the root module or the feature module. And you just need to include the Reactive Forms module. You don't need the Forms module. They are for template-driven. And if you've been using stuff like ng model and all these kind of things, you don't need them. ng model is gone with Reactive Forms. So on the setup part, what we're going to look at are these, the form groups, the form array, and the form control. Now, when I first read the Angular docs, I was like, what are all these groups, controls, arrays? Why do I need them all? So we're going to try and demystify it by looking at just the small conceptual pieces of the pizza app. So the easiest piece is just importing some of these. So we have the form group, the form array, the form control. You can use these for type checking as well. Like if you're passing something down as an input that may be a form array, messed up this, you can import these and use these for type checking. So this is inside a component class. So the basics of the form is that we use something like this.form. You can call it whatever you want. And we instantiate a base form group. So this is basically kicking off the JavaScript side to power the form. You'll see inside of here, there's basically just an object structure. Like if you ignore the form group, form control, form array, there's just plain JavaScript objects and arrays. So we're creating like a small data structure. We have the form, the details. Inside the details, we've got a few properties. And then we've got the pizzas, which is just an array. So what the reactive forms allow us to do, which is really powerful, is basically take these and power the DOM. Because if you use a template-driven approach, you're relying on the template to basically provide you your model, whereas our JavaScript here is what is driving our model. So this will make more sense if you haven't looked at it yet as we continue. So in v4, I think it is, you don't need the no validate tag anymore. So you can kill this one. All you need to do is basically take the base form group that we create. So we have this.form inside of here. And the way that we assemble the DOM needs to basically match that data structure that we create with our form groups. So if you think about these in the exact same object form, we have form. Inside of that, we have the details, which is a high-level object property. Inside of here, we've got a few name, email, confirm. And we've also got the form array name at the bottom, which is just another property. So that and that basically mirror each other. So that, after you've done this piece, so this is basically just bare bones instantiating, getting the project up and running. This will essentially give you something that looks like these at the top. So we have the name, the email, the confirm, the address, the postcode, contact number, which name, email, confirm. And you can see that we don't have all these any value bindings, square bracket value, or ng model, or two-way bindings. So using the form control name as a directive is super powerful. It's just really simple. You just add it to a control. And we call like an input a control. So anything that the user can interact with, a calendar or date picker could be a control. And then we're going to learn later on how to create custom ones. So the form builder, if we quickly memorize this piece. So if you look at the new form group, new form control, you may have seen this when we're actually looking at the documentation, that there is lots of new instances. It gets a bit repetitive. So the easy, quick win is that we just refactor this into using something called the form builder. So that gets injected via the constructor. And you can see that this is just a little bit easier to read. So the form builder is basically an object which does all the instantiation of the new APIs underneath. So here we've got group.group. And you can see for the individual control properties, we don't have to do new control and then pass in a value. Now, what I've added here is the validators object, which we talked about in my short list. So you can see this as an array. So if you haven't used the reactive forms, the array basically allows you to pass a set of arguments. This array, the first argument of the array is the default value. So if I went ahead and added my name in here, saved it out, the name would appear in here. So it does all the synchronization of the values for you. The second argument is for the generic validators. If you have things like min length, max length required, which is exactly what we're using on some of these. The third argument is for asynchronous validators, and I forgot what I was going to say. Third argument is for asynchronous validators. End of. So thinking about everything in terms of being a control. So I think when a lot of people start building applications, they're like, where do I start? So if you think about drawing boxes, I know we try not to mention the word React, but when you go on React website, for example, they have a to-do list, and they teach you how to think about breaking things down into components, and they just draw boxes. So I try and draw boxes for everything. And you can say, this one's going to be a control, this one's going to be a control. So when you start to think about how to design your form in terms of how you're going to actually architect it or build it out, everything is basically a control, and we use these groups and arrays to basically manage them. So the form control is just a control. There we go. The form array is an array of controls, or it can be an array of groups of controls. So we can create our own data structures and power them via the form array. Similarly, for the form group, they are just groups. So we could create a group, which we do actually do in the pizza app, because this is a size. So this is part of the this is a group of controls. And then the pizza has a topping. If I add a new one, we can select a new size and toppings property. So all we're doing when I click Add Pizza is using the form array. So this is really simple and easy to use APIs. And the form builder, a bit noisy at the back. And the form builder is basically a wrapper which encapsulates all of these, keeps the boilerplate quite cleaner, but it's good to know how to use new form control, form group, form array, before you go ahead and start using form builder, because if they change something in form builder, you don't know how to use something else. For example, so form group and custom validation is another thing I want to quickly look at. So if I go ahead and do ABC minus V, and we'll do that. So you can see that it says the emails do not match. So to do this, it looks like conceptually you might think, how do I do this? In Angular, it's quite difficult. But essentially what we can do is add a validation function to the group, which you can say, I would like the email control, I want the confirm email control, and you can just quickly compare the values. Now, this is just a simple example. But you could use something like an asynchronous side where you pass that email into a service, and it will go and validate it and say, no, sorry, your account exists. So these are common patterns that we see on the web. So you can see on line 9, so we take our details group, and we have this validator object with a validator property that we just pass in. Now, all I'm specifying is an email matcher function, which is a function below, which we'll look at. Now, the important piece is that because this is a group, this is just a collection of controls that we want to create, bind to the DOM. Because it's a group, we have to add this on the group level, and you can basically ask for the controls for any of these. We have name, email, phone, address, and postcode. So by adding it to the group, we can ask for any of those controls. We could add multiple validators if we wanted to. So the email matcher function, we have something called an abstract control, which is like an abstract class that the form group, form controls, form arrays extend. So this is simple constant function. We have the function called email matcher. Now, because we bind it to the group, I might flick between up and down. So because we bind it at the group level, what we actually get is the control for that group, and we can just say, OK, I want to go and get the email field. Now, the API is actually really nice, so we can actually use just control.get email. So if you think about it like an object, and you just want to go and get a property, it's basically that. Now, again, we can have the confirm, so you can do control.get confirm. So that will basically go on the group level and goes and gets those two controls. Now, we can say if we do not have the email or we do not have the confirm, we can just bail out and return null. Now, the interesting part is how we do this. So we just compare the values. So if you have a form array or a form group or a form control, there are so many properties on them that you can console log out and play with. But if you want to access raw values like object values or properties, not properties, like strings, like these, for example, email.value will be of type string. And we can just do if A doesn't equal A, which might be B, if we do something like this. So those don't match. We're just doing a simple string comparison. If they do match, we're going to return null, which will not show any errors. Otherwise, we're going to return an object with no match true. Now, that's quite a powerful API in a few lines of code to basically power something quite complex in terms of how you would compare values on the fly and live update them. Now, the way that we plug this in is, you see this property here, we have the no match of true. Obviously, if the emails match, we do not return this object. Continue. There we go. So the most important thing is how we have defined the structure of the DOM. So we have something like a group, control inside, and we can have another group and a control. Now you can nest these indefinitely should you wish. So let's assume that we have the details, the type email, which is the confirm, and the confirm, which are these two up here. Now, let's say we add the message, emails must match. There we go. So all we would need to do, this is, if you've been using Angular for a long time, AngularJS days where we had touch, dirty, all these kind of pristine methods. Now, the API is nice in the reactive forms. You could do things like .touched. So if this field has been interacted with, we can then say, OK, we might want to show whatever the actual error is. So at this point, because we have added, we've returned an object with no match true, this instantly just plugs into our validation. So we can just check that group details has an error called match. And if it does, we'll just simply show the emails must match error. So that is all that is happening here. If we do ABC, ABC, that just vanishes, and they just toggle on the fly. So that's a pretty easy win. Now, form arrays are probably the most interesting, one of the most powerful pieces. which is basically powering this entire piece. So if you consider just that, imagine like an ng4, ng repeat kind of thing, where every time we press add, you see these are just chunks of stuff getting thrown into a group. If we want to remove them, we just press the delete button, and they're nice and easy. So a form array is pretty simple. It doesn't need to be complex. So in plain JavaScript, let's assume that you have a basic array. This is how you can think about form arrays. So if you were writing this purely in plain JavaScript, let's say we want to initialize every pizza with a value of small, which, if I go back, refresh, you see the small is highlighted in blue. So this is basically what I'm doing underneath. And we can say we can have an array of toppings, so we can choose multiple toppings, and they get added. Now, if in JavaScript I wanted to add that object to an array, I can use something like push, or I can just assign a new array and pass the value into the new array. When it comes to removing, it's pretty simple again. We just use a splice. We pass the index down, and we just splice it out. So that's the plain JavaScript side of the form array. So let's jump back to the this.form. Now, the form array in the reactive forms works pretty similarly. It comes with a lot of powerful methods that you can use as well. The most simple ones are, yeah, cool. So the most simple ones are like adding an item, removing an item, which we will cover. I think it's like the 5th one down. So this is like the reactive version, we'll call it. So in the initialization object, at the beginning, we had an array with an empty string and then validators.required. So inside of here, all we're having is size. We're going to initialize it with small. Now, unlike the initial version above, this is the Angular version, so we have validators.required. So we're going to say you need to select the size, otherwise you can't order the pizza. And we're just going to initialize our form array with an empty array. Now, when we want to add a pizza, that actually gets pretty simple. So all we need to do is take that object and actually create a new group. Now, a lot of tutorials or things you might find online just create this definition object and kind of leave it there. Whereas where we've got this array, we might want to actually create something a bit more powerful and add some pizzas, something like this. So at which point, how do we get these objects into the array? We simply can reference the form builder elsewhere in other functions, which makes it quite dynamic. So what we can do is say, I want to create another group. So this is just basically a wrapper function that will just return you a new group when you pass the pizza in. Now, this is just some TypeScript conformity, we'll call it. If you want to add the new group, because the add pizza group function will return a new group, it returns the wrapped object, we'll call it. All we need to do is essentially use that API, the form.getPizzas, and we just simply call push. So you can think of it exactly like plain JavaScript. Now, when I want to remove a pizza, we need to know the index. So we pass the index up. These are like slightly smaller examples than the main big pizza app. So instead of using splice, we just remove at, and you just pass the index in. So there's an interesting thing where form arrays are good when you want to use them with no components. If you want to use a form array with a component, things become a little bit more difficult. So what I tend to do instead is loop over the controls of that particular, so where we're doing like .get pizzas, I pass the pizzas down and then just iterate over these. It seems to be the best approach when componentizing. If you don't need to use loads of components and it's the real simple like login form with 2 buttons, don't need to use it. So this is the actual implementation of that. So what you can actually do is essentially just grab pieces of your data structure for the form and just pass them down to different components. Now you can This will basically render out the add pizza, and you can select items. So what we basically do is the form.get, which takes the whole instance of the form. We go and get that particular form array, and we just pass it down. And then above, we just iterate it and print them out. Now, the most interesting piece is the custom form controls, in my opinion. Anyway, forms are exciting in weird ways. So custom form control, if you think of it like input type number that you might add, you bind something to it, you increment a few values, and then your manager says that it doesn't look very good. So you have to go and build your own custom control, up and down buttons, for example. So this is how you can basically create any kind of custom form component that directly goes back and talks to your form group. Now this gets powerful, and I'll call it fun, because it's kind of weirdly fun. So the way that we can do this is basically, instead of binding like input form control name equals my email address, we can actually bind the form control name to the component. Now this allows the component to then interact with the reactive forms, so we can basically ask for some of the private handlers in the reactive forms, and Angular will give this them. Now we have the basis. So let's assume that we're using pizza size. We give 3 options. We want to create large, medium, small. This then directly corresponds to these guys here. Inside the template, we can simply just iterate nice and simple, and log out pizza size, add a dynamic class, and say the size in the middle. So that will give us the 3 actual fake controls. Now, the interesting piece is where we can add a custom input, or create a custom input, hide it, display none underneath. So this is inside the same template. So if you imagine we've just created this, added a new input. Now, because it's a radio button, you see I can only select one of these. We use the type of radio. If you want to use the checkbox, you can obviously select multiple values. Now, when we're iterating inside of the sizes, we want to bind specific pieces of data down to the component. Now, the interesting piece is these events, the blur, the change, the focus, and we're just using checked value equals size to actually update. Now, when we, so if you try and remember the on blur, on change, on focus. So we pass all the sizes down, which we're just iterating over in the ng4. So each of these is going to have blur, focus, events, and we can tab. So if you just take that real basic component, we have our pizza size, we render out 3 words. They don't have to actually look pretty with the actual piece of graphic. But it comes to the point where we can click on the pizza, perhaps, but how do we communicate back to the reactive form? Now, this is where the control value accessor comes into play. So this is the interface. If you go on the Angular docs, you can control value accessor, go and read these. Now, we have write value, register on changed, or on change, and register on touch. The set disabled state is optional. So I'm just going to tell you those. We'll cover them in this bit. So this is the same component as what we just looped over. We had our small, medium, large pizzas. Now, what we need to do is import 2 things, the control value accessor and something called the ng value accessor. So inside our pizza size component, where we're looping small, medium, large, we add a providers. We say, I want to provide the value of the ng value accessor. You'll only need to do this because it's a configuration step. And we say, use the existing value of our pizza size component. So what we're basically doing is taking our component and all the logic that we will write, and we basically provide it to the ng value accessor, when we implement a control value accessor. It's kind of a weird wiring configuration, but essentially that's all you need to do. Now, this is literally set up, and then we'll get onto the coding. So we import the control value accessor, we do the configuration, we say I want to pass my component and actually register that. Now, all you need to do is add implements control value accessor. We then get a few functions that we have to conform to, which are these. We had the right value, register on change, register on touched. So what we do, we can't use the functions directly. So what we do is create a few internal methods or placeholder methods. We have on model change, private, on touch, and the value. So the value will be whatever's given from the form control. If somebody has half checked out and come back to their order, they might have clicked medium before. So we give them the value passed down from the form. Now, these are the interesting pieces because we have the register on changed, which this just simply gives us a function. So at first I was like, why do the reactive forms just give me a function? So all I do is just bind this inside the component class. You say on model change is going to be that function. So this is a function that's actually given to you by the reactive forms. So when something changes, you just call it. So this is how you can interact with the reactive forms, which is the this.form group, and you can talk to whatever control that you want to. Now, the register on touched is interesting as well, because if you do things like validation, you'll want to do .touched or .dirty, these kind of things. Now, if you have a blur event or a focus event, or blur, we then say, OK, that has now been interacted with. We want to then call this touched function. So when you inspect element in the DOM and you see ng pristine, ng dirty, ng touched, all of these, you control when Angular sets those via this function. So this is the reactive form API is saying, you can have this function, but you need to call it and tell me when something is touched or dirty. So we basically have to register these three functions. We can store them internally. Excuse me. We store them internally, and we just call them throughout sort of the life cycle of whatever our component does. Now, the right value is very simple. Typically, will look just like that. So the value coming in from the function argument, let's say I go to my pizza app and I do Todd. Let's assume that saves what I've just typed in memory, local storage or something like this. Let's say I refresh. The value Todd is stored for that particular control. When our component is initialized, it will just give us that initial value. So that allows us to then bind it to our custom component. So if the user has select a medium pizza size and we refresh, or they come back and save their data, this will just give us medium, for example, or the object that defines that. We then can use like a model change. So this is just a custom function wrapper which says, I'm going to update the local model and the this.onModel change value has changed. Now, the onChange, if you have a look, it takes the value, and we call this.onModel change with the value. So you can see this function here, I hope. Let me try and move it up. Nope. So we have the onModel change, which will simply just get given the size. So we're iterating. We have small, medium, large. We pass the size in. When something changes, we get given that size. Now, this would allow us to basically go back and write a value directly to our form. It keeps things in sync. And all you need to do to actually keep things in sync is just call this onModel change. Now, when you build out a form, what you typically do is have your huge form, then you have that massive object pre-tags underneath, and you might do this.value or something like this, pipe it to JSON, and you work from that and make sure your data structure is correct. Now, if you didn't call the onModel change, but you used the right value function, which will give you the initial value, if you didn't use the onModel change, your JSON object wouldn't be updated. So this is basically completing the full synchronization. So that's the end, but I want to show you some code, some in-depth code. So I actually mentioned that I rewrote this a few days ago. It was more of a restructure and tidy things up so I can feel OK showing you guys. So a lot of things start with, how much time have I got? Cool. So a lot of things start with like just a base form tag, and then they start with like a group and then an input. So what I want to do is talk through some of the architecture behind this, and then if you've got any questions, you can come and chat to me after or ask for the GitHub repo. So all I've basically got is a app component. I'm going to try and blow this up quick. Let's try 20. That looks good to me. Cool. So we have the app component. Everybody's created an app component. Now, inside it, we could route to it. What I'm simply doing is just pizza app, so we can pretend that this has been routed to. So we have our pizza app. Now, it's all good sort of looking at form arrays, form groups, form controls, but then how do they kind of fit together in the bigger picture? So I'm going to be flicking between the sidebar for a few minutes. So what we basically have inside this pizza app component, we got the pizza viewer. So, pizza viewer, pizza form. That nearly just knocked my water over. That was horrendous. So on the left, pizza viewer. On the right, pizza form. So this is kind of my thinking on how to go down and break these down into components. Now, with something like NGRX store or a store of some kind in your own service, this might be a little bit cleaner. I've looked at approaches for minimizing these types of bindings. One of them was using the ng content, so we can transclude 1.x terms. We can transclude an element through our pizza form, so we can reduce the bindings. Because if we've got 5 layers or 5+ layers of components, you end up passing lots of chain messages down. Now that's vanilla Angular. So if you want to use something like NGRX, then it reduces that. But pure vanilla Angular is trying to clean up the way that we do bindings. So let's dive into the pizza form. Now, I've broken these down into what I call containers and components. So the containers folder basically holds the smart components. So this is the component that typically would go ahead. See, we've got this remove the pizza, the toggle pizza, the submit pizza. So when a person has made an order, this is probably the component that has the service, and it goes off to the back end and says this person wants this pizza. So this is the real world implementation of this. We have the form. I'm using the shorthand FormBuilder. Have the details. Have a custom validator. What I've done is break out the pizza validators into a class, so we can create all these different properties on there, and initialize the form array with an initial pizza. So you can see all the toppings when you land on the page. We inject the form builder. Inside the ng on init, there's a couple of interesting things happening. So we've got calculate total. Now the value changes is, if we ignore these, you can look at this line. We've looked at that a few times in validation. So you can go and ask for a specific control. Now it has a property on that control called value changes. So we could subscribe to the changes of the entire form, but really I don't really care about if somebody enters this or this. I want to know if somebody's changed what was going to change the price. So if I start adding some toppings, you can see this total down here is changing. Now, the only way to change the price is to change the pizza size or the toppings. So all I'm going to do is subscribe to that particular control group and then recalculate the total based off that. Create pizza. it's a pretty simple one. This just returns a wrapped form group. We initialize it with small. It's got to be required. We can add the pizza. All we're using is control.push, so we just push a new pizza, which this.createPizza returns, which is this one above. You can pass these down. You can make them like extremely dynamic. With the template-driven approach, it's much more difficult to sort of reason with data structures. This makes it a lot easier. Remove the pizza. All we're doing is remove at. The index gets passed out from the child. We'll investigate some of the source code momentarily. So the interesting part is how to connect form groups and form controls. If you've tried, which one? No, it's way back. I'm not even going to try. If you've created something like this and then tried to break it down into components, it's not difficult, but there's no like, here's how to do it with components. So what we do is basically take this .form, which is the entire form group, and all I'm doing is saying the parent is equal to the form. So what I'm doing is passing a reference down of the entire object. Now, this will make more sense when we actually dive inside the pizza form. So this is where all the complex action takes place. This is the important piece, the form group. So this allows us to have a dynamic component or a form registered inside the form. So I'm not actually referencing the form group square bracket form. I'm passing a form down and then saying this component, which is the form in this case, but if we had multiple components, this is how we break them down and register them in the forms. Now, at the minute, there's not a beautiful, clean way to manage inputs, labels, validation messages. So you could put these inside like a function that just returns whether it's true, whether it's valid or not. Now, the piece which I want to show you are these pizza creator and the pizza summary. The summary is not as great. This one. So you can see how these layers kind of, we have the form in the smart component, and then I'm passing it down into, we'll call it a dumb component, and then I'm passing it or delegating particular properties down into further components. Now, the pizza creator, where is it? There we go. So this is the real-life pizza size custom form control. We also have the pizza toppings, which is, again, another custom form control. Now, if you want to check out the actual source code to this, I have got the link on the slides. Oh, where is it? Toppings. There we go. So if you want to check out the source code to this, or come and find me throughout the day, I'll happily sit down and talk about these. So this is the pizza toppings. If we go into here, so I can click on these, but I can also press the space bar. So we can also use the tab. So we can make these custom controls more accessible than you would typically do with a custom control. Now, the way that we can do this, we have these on blur, on change, on focus. We didn't actually demo them in the slides. This is the real source code with the control value accessor. So here we've got an array of toppings. We simply just iterate over those. We then have the control value accessor give us the change function. It gives us the touched function. So when someone selects a topping, I can say it's been touched. When they select a topping, it's also been changed. So we want to update the model at the same time. We get any initial values. Our initial value for toppings is an empty array, so no actual selections are made. There we go. So here, for example, we have the this.onTouch. So on focus, we then call this onTouch, which if we go ahead and inspect, I'll give it a refresh first. Yeah, there we go. I'm hoping that kind of is visible. So these pieces here, ng untouched, ng pristine. Now, I know they're only class names, but they come in quite handy for actual user interaction, saying this is invalid. Yes, this was all good. So when I click one of these, you see that that's just changed, and these have all just changed to valid. It's been touched. It's now dirty. Depending on your use case, what you're building, you'll want to use the simple touch method. And when the value gets updated via your control, if it was a calendar, date picker, something like this, you'll write your custom date picker, pass an object back, and you'll just pass it to the control, say this is the date that they chose. Now that makes things a lot easier. That's kind of it. If you want to come and ask questions afterwards, come and find me or tweet me at Todd Motto. I hope that was kind of good. I know it's a lot to get through in 9 in the morning. Yeah, right, thank you.